So, you see, it really begins to focus this problem, just what is music, if it isn't the noise made by musical instruments? Well, we could go on talking about that for most of the evening, but I don't intend to. On the whole, my view of music is that it's the sort of sounds made by musical instruments that you want to hear. And if you don't want to hear it, then it isn't music at that particular time. And if you're trying to do your homework when somebody next door is playing the most beautiful music, which you're really very fond of, as far as you're concerned, that can be noise because it's distracting you from what you want to do. And you've either got to decide to go away and do your homework or give up and listen to the music. It's got to be one or the other. And so, in my book, music is sounds made by musical instruments that I want to hear, or that somebody else wants to hear. Well, of course, up to now, we've really been looking at very, very complicated sorts of sounds, mixtures of enormous amounts of sound. And the other thing that we probably ought to do is to go right to the other end of the spectrum, if I can use that word, and have a look at some very, very simple musical sounds. And the simplest sort of musical sound that one could imagine is what a physicist would call a pure tone. A musician might call it a steady note. A mathematician might call it a sine wave. And it looks and sounds like this. I'll just speed up the oscilloscope a bit so that you can see it better. And as you can see, it's absolutely regular. It's repeating regularly in time. You can imagine this going on forever, never changing. And it can be described with really just two numbers. One to tell you how big it is, and the other to tell you how many repeats there are every second, and that's really all you need to know. The other simplest kind of sound was the one that crept in just at the end there, this sort of thing. And that is what a physicist would call white noise. It's completely random. Again, you could imagine it going on forever, and whereas the first one had, perhaps it was very dull musically, but it did have a definite pitch associated with it, this one has no pitch associated with it. Well, we could go on for quite a long time looking at the various ways in which the size is related to the noise and so on and so forth. There's just one that I think we ought to just demonstrate, and that is how the pitch, the musical pitch that we hear, is related to the frequency that we measure, the number of vibrations every second. There's the sine wave again. And you can see how they're related. We'll go down now instead of up. And I think you can see that, roughly speaking, well, in fact it's precise, but you can only see it roughly, that if you double the frequency, you go up an octave. If you halve the frequency, you go down an octave. Well, in some ways, that's about as far as we need to go in thinking about simple musical sounds, because we've already got enough information to start making a musical instrument. All we need is to make variations in the pressure of the air that are regular, and if we want to play tunes, we need to make them either more rapid or less rapid, high frequency or low frequency, in order to play tunes. So we've got enough information to start making simple instruments. I've got here some couple of brass rods. They're just about 5 millimeters, and they're solid. I have resin on my gloves, and what I'm going to do is to find, first of all, the midpoint by a subsidiary, very scientific experiment, and then having found it, I'm going to stroke the rod like that. And I think you can hear that we get quite a loud sound. I've lost the midpoint. There we are. And it persists for quite a long time. What is happening? Well, resin has very peculiar frictional properties. It has a very low dynamic friction. If the two surfaces are moving together, it's quite low friction. But if it's static, if the two things are not moving, then the friction is very high. So what happens when I first grip the rod, it's static friction, very high, and so when I pull, I actually stretch the rod by a very small amount. Having stretched it by a very small amount, then the forces in the rod overcome the friction and it starts to move. And once it starts to move, it goes on moving because of the low dynamic friction. And it moves for a while and then starts to come back again, and as it comes back it goes at the same speed as my glove, and so my glove, as it were, picks it up again. So we keep getting this sticking and slipping. In fact, we call it stick-slip motion. It's very logical, and it's much the same as the motion you get if you're playing a violin with a bow. The bow picks up the string, pulls it to one side, then it slips back, pulls it to one side again, slips back, and so on. Well, every time it slips, a little pulse travels to one end of the rod, travels back again, and travels up again, and goes backwards and forwards, being reinforced by the glove each time. And each time it gets to the end, of course, it sends out a little pressure wave, and because it takes the same time every time to go up and down, we get a regular series of pressure waves. So if we want to make a higher pitch note, what we want is a shorter piece of rod, so it takes less time to run up and down. Well, we'll just listen to that one again to get that note in mind. And if I now take a slightly shorter piece of rod and do that, we get a higher pitch. So in principle, all we need to make a musical instrument is to have a whole collection of those of different lengths, and then when you want to play a tune, you just pick them up, find the midpoint and stroke them. You're limited to slow Welsh hymn tunes, but otherwise it's quite a good way of playing music. But it is in fact typical of one class of musical instrument, which is a very important one. The harp, the xylophone, the piano, the organ, all belong to that class. That's the class of instruments where you have a separate vibrator for each note you want to play. And in fact, from a scientific point of view, the piano is not one instrument, it's 88 separate instruments, each of which has only one note. And you bring them into operation by pressing the appropriate key at the appropriate time.